Welcome, everyone. This is a special meeting called by the Wellstone Club on the situation, the war in Ukraine. My name is Ann Schwartz, and I'm the chair of the Wellstone Peace Committee. We're a grassroots organization that's affiliated with the California Democratic Party. And we're basically progressive activists who are committed to building electoral power and strengthening social justice movements. I would like to introduce Michael Klare, who's a professor at Hampshire College and is an expert in, I would say, both the arms race and the efforts at arms control and nuclear disarmament. So my pleasure to turn this over to you, Michael.
Okay, I'm going to begin with what I think is obvious. That is, we've entered a new phase of history. I've heard it discussed already as the post-Ukraine era. And I think we could compare this to the moment when we went from the Cold War era to the post-Cold War era. We're going to see dramatic changes in global political, military, and economic affairs. And I think it's going to require, in turn, corresponding shifts in our understandings, our analyses, and our political strategies. Let me start my presentation with this proposition, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine may mark the official beginning of this new era that we've entered. But from my perspective, it began really 4 years ago, in February 2018, when the US Department of Defense adopted its new National Defense Strategy, the NDS, which proclaimed that from now on, great power competition, not counterterrorism, would be the defining principle of US military strategy. Now, a little background on this. Ever since 9/11, counterterrorism, or what was called the global war on terror, was deemed the defining principle of US foreign policy and military policy. This resulted, as you know, in the war in Afghanistan, US invasion of Iraq, and what came to be called the Forever Wars. It resulted in low-intensity conflicts around the world, in Somalia, Yemen, Mali, dozens of other places. But by 2016, by the 2016 election, the American people had become fed up with the Forever Wars. And I think this was a key factor in helping Donald Trump get elected. But the persistence of Islamophobia in the Republican Party, the rise of ISIS, the momentum of the Forever Wars made it hard to shift policy. So the global war on terror remained the #1 US strategic priority. By 2018, however, a revolt was underway among the US foreign policy and military policy elites, what people in Washington call the blob, the establishment elites who largely determine US foreign policy and have done so for decades. We're talking about senior generals, former cabinet members, former diplomats, the pundits in Washington, the think tank people who all are interchangeable, they're bipartisan, and have largely defined US foreign policy. They have and have had one overriding objective: to ensure that the United States remains the world's paramount power indefinitely. And as a corollary to that, that no other power ever be allowed to overtake the US in that position or even come close. As the global war on terror ground on, the blob concluded that the Forever Wars were not only costly and futile, they were endangering America's dominant status by allowing its two top competitors, Russia and China, to gain advantages over the US on the geopolitical chessboard and to whittle away America's advantage, something that people considered wholly intolerable. From the blob's perspective, this had to stop. From now on, they concluded things had to go in the other direction. The US had to start moving ahead of Russia and China by abandoning the global war on terror and by investing in the capabilities to ensure even greater overmatch, that's their word, overmatch of Russia and China in the years ahead. So without consulting President Trump, the blob conducted a strategic coup in 2018, ditched the global war on terror in favor of their new strategic catchword, great power competition. And I want to read to you, it's rare that you get candid talk from people who shape policy in Washington, the power brokers, the power elite, but occasionally you hear from them. This is Secretary of Defense Mark Esper on September 16, 2020 at the RAND Corporation. I want you to hear the way they think, why we're in the current, because it helps understand where we are today. He said, for nearly 2 decades, the United States concentrated on fighting violent extremist organizations in low-intensity conflicts that left us less focused and less prepared for a high-end fight against near-peer adversaries. Near-peer adversaries meaning countries that were not quite as powerful as us, but coming close. For years, our military was in a period of strategic atrophy and burning down readiness as our adversaries watched from the sidelines, searching for opportunities to erode our hard-earned gains. This is Russia and China. Today, with a view of the world very different from our own, emboldened competitors are using their growing power to coercively alter the strategic environment to our detriment. Given these challenges, in 2018, the Department of Defense developed the National Defense Strategy, the NDS, which states we are now in this era of great power competition and defines the challenges we face. The NDS directs us to adapt to this increasingly complex security environment in order to deter conflict, and if necessary, fight and win. So that gives you a sense of the thinking of this strategic coup in 2018 and the thinking of the blob, that we have to now reverse course and take on Russia and China full thrust. Esper went on to describe how the Department of Defense has begun to undertake this struggle to reverse the losses of the past 2 decades and again overtake Russia and China. This would occur on 2 fronts: military modernization and alliance reinforcement. On the front of military modernization, it was to include the replacement of the entire US nuclear arsenal with all new weapons at a cost of $1.8 trillion. And that modernization is now underway with new bombers, ICBMs, and submarines under construction. It also would include the shift from buying low-tech weapons useful in a war against guerrillas to acquiring high-tech weapons for a war against Russia and China for the high-end fight. And it included investment in advanced technologies, hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, robotics, to ensure that the US would be always ahead of Russia and China indefinitely into the future, and that the gap between the US and those countries would increase over time, not diminish. In the area of alliance reinforcement, US strategy calls for reinvestment in NATO, especially in the frontline states, the Poland, Ethiopia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and Romania, building up NATO's strength there, moving more forces to the frontline states. And in Asia, where there's no NATO, creating a proto-NATO, the Quad, for the alliance of the US, Australia, India, and Japan, to create a foundation for NATO to surround China and to strangle it to death. Now, All of this was evident to military analysts in Washington and others who followed military affairs, but it's not what the media was following, or the progressive left of the peace movement for that matter. We remained focused on the forever wars. But all of these moves were all evident to Russian and Chinese leaders, who no doubt found them alarming and who expressed their concern about what was happening to no avail. But if you were a Chinese or Russian general watching the chess pieces on the global chessboard, you could see the growing movement of US forces, increasingly powerful US forces, surrounding you on all sides, at every stretch of the Russian perimeter or the Chinese perimeter. And they could calculate that as time went on, they would face an ever greater US military threat on their perimeter. Just as one example that popped into my head, this extraordinary decision to create an alliance this fall, the AUKUS, Australia, UK, US alliance, so the US could supply nuclear submarine technology to Australia to better fight China. This is the sort of developments happening on the European front and the Asian front. It's not unsurprising that these countries became increasingly alarmed and took countermeasures. China has accelerated the expansion of its navy and appears to be expanding its nuclear arsenal. Russia accelerated the modernization of its military forces and invested in new technologies. Now, to what degree was all this a factor in prompting Putin to invade Ukraine this past week? I can't answer that with any certainty. He does seem to have an obsession with Ukraine that is not entirely rational. We could talk about this, but I am sure that his generals were telling him that the strategic balance in Europe was turning against Russia and would become ever more hostile to Russia as the days and months and years went into the future. And that might have led him to conclude that if he ever did intend to invade Ukraine, he had better do it sooner rather than later, because the balance of forces was turning against him. I also think that Putin and his cronies misread the US withdrawal from Afghanistan last summer. The press, the media, the right wing, parts of the left, and Russian commentators all said that it was a sign of weakness on the part of the US. And maybe this encouraged him, but that's a mistake. From the blob's point of view, it was a sign of strength that we finally pulled ourselves out of this disastrous conflict on an unimportant piece of the global chessboard, so that the US could move its pieces, its main pieces, to the more important parts of the global chessboard, Europe and Asia. So Putin badly miscalculated in my mind, and he's going to pay terribly. So now we come to the post-Ukraine era, or as I prefer, the era of geopolitical contestation, an era of endless great power competition, accompanied by recurring crises, arms buildups, and wars. What conclusions can we draw from all this at this early stage from the tragedy in Ukraine? Great power competition has emerged triumphant and will dominate US policy for a long time to come. This means much higher defense spending. Last year, President Biden brought in a defense budget to Congress of $715 billion. Congress raised it to $740 billion. This year, you could expect a defense budget to start at $800 billion And the Republicans and the Democrats are going to say they're going to push it much higher than that. And it's all going to go for new high-tech weapons aimed at Russia and China. We will see an acceleration of US nuclear weapons acquisition and rebuff any attempt to slow the nuclear arms race. There'll be a huge boost to NATO and the Quad. I think we're going to see an increase in military culture, militarism, patriotic gore, an intolerance of dissent, an increase in anti-Asian racism and hate. I will just finish by saying that our primary task in the months and years ahead will be to counter the great power competition ideology, the notion that we are embroiled in a relentless military competition with Russia and China forever. As we know from the Cold War period, such a stance takes over everything, preventing progress on any of the issues we care about. Already, for example, Biden has signaled that climate change has ceased to be a priority, despite a recent UN report saying that the danger of climate change is only getting worse. But climate change is now off the table as a concern. So all of us who care about climate change, about poverty, about racism, about education, we have to combine whatever we do with opposition to the ideology of great power competition and geopolitical contestation, or we'll fail to make progress on all the issues we care about.
Two questions. One is about, was this parallel to the 1939 situation? And second, what does this mean about possibilities of changing what we're doing about oil and gas drilling?
No, it's not similar to 1939, but it is similar to 1962. I say that in the sense that in 1939, Germany was an ascendant power. It was building its strength, and Britain and the U.S. did not have they had allowed their militaries to atrophy at that time, France as well, but the US was isolationist and the UK hadn't built up its military, and Germany was the ascendant military power. That's not true today because NATO is the ascendant power, as I indicated earlier, and Russia is a descendant power. The more you look into the future, more the balance of power is going to shift against it, and I could talk longer about that demographically, economically, and otherwise. But Putin has threatened the use of nuclear weapons. If things escalate, if the US were to start supplying weapons inside Ukraine, for example, which is a topic of conversation, Putin has threatened we're gonna respond with maximum force, and he's implied nuclear weapons. You have to worry about a nuclear escalation situation here. I think it's small, but it's not infinitesimal. And I'm very worried about that. So it's more like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 in my mind. On the energy question, this has demonstrated the dependency that we have developed in the industrial world on fossil fuels, in Europe, especially on Russian oil and gas. And until we develop more our domestic sources of energy from the sun and wind, that's going to be a liability. So developing green energy is crucial.
And I wanted to know what the speaker's opinion is on providing arms to the Ukrainian resistance, fostering negotiations eventually between Ukraine and Russia.
You know, I struggle with this myself, because I'm so struck by the heroism of ordinary Ukrainian citizens taking up weapons to defend their country. And I could imagine, although I'm a little old for this, but I could imagine in their shoes, I would want to do the same, and I would want help. The priority is to cease fire as quickly as possible. And I worry that attempts to prolong the fighting is not going to, by supplying arms, while I'm in sympathy with the reason for doing that, believe me, I don't think that that's going to reduce the suffering in Ukraine. At this point, the necessity is to stop the fighting. And so the priority is for intervention by world leaders to get the two sides to sit down together as quickly as possible and stop the fighting, rather than to prolong it in any way, because of the imbalance of forces.
What is Putin's incentive? What kind of stick can the US use to help him come to the table? If the sanctions are not a valid stick, what's going to bring him to the table?
I think that the sanctions may have an effect, because I think that large sectors of Russian society that heretofore have let Putin do what he wants without questioning are now seeing that they have a stake in the outcome of this, and they're discovering that they're going to pay a very high price for not having opposed Putin in the past or done anything about it. And so maybe this will lead to some kind of move behind the scenes that will force Putin to make a shift. If I were the commander-in-chief of the Russian military, I would be saying to myself, this is an utter disaster, because our hope to build the Russian military into a modern war machine, which is what they have to do to confront the United States, is going to be badly damaged by these sanctions in the future. So just the Russian military would have an interest in getting rid of them. The Chinese are watching all of this and seeing how the Russian economy is being crippled by sanctions. And they have to be saying to themselves that the West has these economic means of levers, and they're quite powerful. And China could be exposed to the same thing. And I think China has the power to, not the power, but has influence. Nobody else does, maybe, but China might have the influence to force Putin to stop. Contrary to what Trump has said, and people are saying that China's behind this, I think the Chinese are scared out of their minds by what's happening, that they see how Russia is being isolated and disgraced and hurt. So I think that large sectors or important sectors of Russia might be saying, we have to do something about this. Now, how that'll play itself out, I'm not entirely sure. I ended my presentation by saying everything we do must begin with a critique of the ideology of great power competition. If we don't do that, all the other things we do are not going to succeed, because that ideology will prevail over everything. And I suggest for reading to understand our period is George Orwell's 1984. He described the current period perfectly, about an era of constant geopolitical contestation, and everybody was required in society to go along with that. That's the kind of period that we're entering. And if we don't if we don't say that ideology, which is being trapped up with, democracy and the rule of law and the other, we're in a global struggle for survival against authoritarians and rule breakers like China and Iran and Russia and their co-fellows. If we don't challenge that, that'll sweep us away. So we just have to do that. Now, I spoke to Wellstone Club earlier on the issue of China, which is going to remain the greatest long-term chosen enemy of the United States. So Taiwan is now going to become the cutting edge of the US effort to attack our great power rivals. And this could easily provoke a nuclear war, just as Ukraine can. And we really have to combat the notion that China is our mortal enemy, because the war with a struggle with China is very different from Russia. That will mean tearing up the global economy. It will extend to anti-Asian racism and violence and hate in the United States, which we've already seen. So we really must educate ourselves about this and contest the notion that America is chosen to lead a global struggle in this ongoing contestation.
On behalf of the Wellstone Democratic Renewal Club, I want to say thank you so much to Michael Klare for sharing your very informed opinions with us. And also thank you to everybody who participated in the conversation and the chat. So thank you to everybody for participating.